The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle's courtyard. Thomas Mitchell, a 28-year-old royal guard, stood at his post with the same discipline he had maintained for the past 5 years. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, his black bearskin hat positioned with military precision, and his rifle held at exactly the regulation angle. To the hundreds of tourists who had passed by that day, he was not Thomas Mitchell. He was simply part of the ancient tradition of the Queen's Guard. Thomas had always taken pride in his role. Growing up in a small village outside London, he had dreamed of serving his country with honor. His father, a former soldier himself, had taught him that respect was not just given, it was earned through dedication, discipline, and unwavering commitment to duty. When Thomas finally earned his place among the Queen's Guard, it felt like the culmination of everything he had worked toward. The Queen's Guard had a reputation that stretched back centuries. They were known not just for their distinctive uniforms and stoic expressions, but for their ability to remain completely still and silent, no matter what happened around them. This wasn't just ceremony. It was a demonstration of mental strength and professional discipline that few could understand or appreciate. On this particular Tuesday morning, the castle grounds were already filling with tourists from around the world. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, trying to get the guards to smile or move. Adults snapped countless photos, often making jokes about the toy soldiers who stood motionless at their posts. Thomas had heard it all before. The comments, the attempts to distract him, the occasional disrespectful behavior. It was all part of the job. But Thomas understood something that many visitors didn't. His role wasn't just about standing still and looking impressive for photographs. He was part of an active security detail, trained to respond to genuine threats while maintaining the dignity and tradition of his position. Every guard carried live ammunition and was prepared to defend the royal family and the castle grounds if necessary. The stillness wasn't weakness, it was controlled strength. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed a particular visitor who seemed different from the usual tourists. The man was in his 40s, wearing a wrinkled business suit and carrying himself with an air of frustration that was immediately noticeable. Unlike other visitors who approached with curiosity or respect, this man seemed agitated from the moment he arrived at the castle gates. The stranger moved through the crowd with obvious irritation, pushing past other tourists and making loud comments about the waste of taxpayer money represented by the guards. His voice carried across the courtyard, and Thomas could see other visitors beginning to feel uncomfortable with the man's increasingly aggressive behavior. What struck Thomas most was not the man's words, but his demeanor. This wasn't someone having a bad day or expressing casual criticism. There was something deeper at work, a kind of anger and resentment that seemed to be building with each passing minute. The man kept staring at Thomas and the other guards, his jaw clenched and his hands balled into fists. Thomas had been trained to assess threats, and every instinct told him that this situation was escalating beyond normal tourist behavior. Yet his training also demanded that he maintain his position and composure unless there was a direct threat to safety. The balance between vigilance and discipline was one of the most challenging aspects of his role. The morning crowd grew larger, and with it, the stranger's agitation seemed to increase. He began making increasingly personal comments about the guards, questioning their intelligence, their worth, and their right to exist in modern society. Other tourists started moving away from the man, sensing that something was wrong. Thomas could see his fellow guards maintaining their positions with the same professional discipline, but he knew they were all aware of the developing situation. Communication between the guards was subtle but constant. A slight shift in posture, a barely perceptible turn of the head, small signals that confirmed they were all monitoring the same potential threat. The stranger's behavior became more erratic as he realized his comments were not provoking any visible reaction from the guards. He seemed frustrated by their refusal to engage, as if their professional composure was somehow a personal insult to him. This was exactly the kind of situation that could escalate quickly, if not handled properly. Thomas reflected on his training and the countless hours he had spent learning not just how to stand at attention, but how to read situations and people. The guards were taught that their stillness and silence were not signs of weakness or indifference, but demonstrations of strength and control. Every day brought new challenges to that control, but this morning felt different. The castle grounds continued to fill with visitors, but the atmosphere had changed. The stranger's presence was creating a tension that even the youngest children could sense. Parents began steering their families away from the area where the man was pacing, and the usual cheerful chatter of tourists was replaced by nervous whispers and concerned glances. Thomas knew that whatever was building would come to a head soon. The man's anger was not dissipating with time. It was concentrating, focusing on the guards as symbols of everything he seemed to resent. In his peripheral vision, Thomas could see security personnel beginning to position themselves more strategically around the courtyard, though they remained discreet and non-confrontational. The morning sun climbed higher, but the shadow of confrontation was falling across Windsor Castle's ancient stones. Thomas Mitchell, standing perfectly still in his red tunic and bearskin hat, was about to face a test that would challenge everything he believed about duty, respect, and the true meaning of strength. The stranger in the wrinkled suit was moving closer, and with each step, the potential for conflict grew stronger. What neither the guard nor the agitated visitor could know was that the events of the next few minutes would create a moment that would be remembered and retold for years to come. A lesson about respect that would reach far beyond the castle walls and touch the lives of everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. David Brennan, the 43-year-old man in the wrinkled suit, had been having the worst month of his life. 3 weeks ago, he had lost his job at a London accounting firm after 15 years of service. His wife had asked for a separation, and his teenage daughter barely spoke to him anymore. He felt like everything he had worked for was crumbling around him, and he needed someone to blame. When David woke up that morning, he hadn't planned to visit Windsor Castle. He had been walking aimlessly through London, trying to clear his head and figure out what to do next with his life. But as he passed a tour group heading toward the castle, something inside him snapped. Here were people spending money they probably didn't have to gawk at symbols of privilege and tradition that felt completely disconnected from his struggles. David had always been a proud man. He believed in hard work and fair treatment, and he couldn't understand why his loyalty to his company hadn't been enough to save his job. The sight of the guards standing motionless in their expensive uniforms while ordinary people like him suffered in silence felt like a personal insult. These guards, he thought, were living symbols of a system that had failed him. As David approached Thomas Mitchell's post, his anger crystallized into a specific target. Here was someone who probably earned a decent salary for doing nothing more than standing still and looking decorative, while David worried about paying his mortgage and explaining to his daughter why he couldn't afford her university fees. This guard was playing dress-up with taxpayer money. The tourists around David seemed to sense his mood and gave him a wide berth. A family with young children moved to a different area of the courtyard after the father noticed David's clenched fists and heard his muttered complaints. An elderly couple who had been taking photos near Thomas's post quietly relocated when David began pacing back and forth, his agitation growing more obvious by the minute. Thomas, meanwhile, remained perfectly still, but his trained eyes were tracking David's every movement. The guard could see the signs he had been taught to recognize: the aggressive body language, the fixed stare, the way David's breathing had become shallow and rapid. This wasn't just an unhappy tourist making complaints. This was someone on the edge of losing control. Other members of the Queen's Guard had also noticed the situation developing. Without breaking their positions or showing any outward sign of communication, they were all aware that David represented a potential threat. Their training had prepared them for exactly this kind of scenario. But theory was very different from facing an actual confrontation. The castle's security team had positioned themselves strategically around the courtyard, but their policy was to intervene only if absolutely necessary. The guards were expected to handle difficult situations themselves whenever possible, and premature intervention could sometimes escalate, rather than diffuse a tense situation. David's internal monologue was becoming increasingly bitter and focused. He looked at Thomas's perfectly pressed uniform and polished boots and saw everything that was wrong with his world. Here was someone who had job security, respect, and purpose, while David felt like he had nothing. The unfairness of it all was eating away at his self-control. The morning crowd continued to flow around them, but David was becoming increasingly isolated in his bubble of anger. Other tourists were avoiding eye contact with him and steering clear of his immediate area. Children who had been excitedly trying to get the guard's attention just minutes before were now being hurried along by their parents. Thomas could see that David was working himself up to something. The man's pacing had become more agitated, and he was now talking to himself in a low, angry voice that other visitors couldn't quite hear but clearly found unsettling. The guard knew from his training that people in this state could become unpredictable very quickly. What David didn't understand was that Thomas had his own struggles. The young guard's father was battling cancer, and Thomas had been working extra shifts to help cover medical expenses not covered by insurance. His girlfriend had been pressuring him to leave the military and find a normal job with better hours and higher pay. Thomas had his own moments of doubt about his chosen path, but he had learned to channel those feelings into stronger commitment to his duty. The irony was that both men were facing challenges that might have created understanding and empathy if they had met under different circumstances. But David saw only what he wanted to see, a symbol of privilege and waste, while Thomas saw a potential threat that he needed to monitor and manage. According to his training, David's anger finally reached a breaking point when a group of tourists began taking photos near Thomas's post, laughing and joking about trying to make the guards smile. To David, their light-hearted attitude toward something he saw as a serious problem was the final straw. These people were treating the whole thing like a game while he was struggling just to survive. Without fully thinking through his actions, David pushed through the group of tourists and approached Thomas directly. His face was red with anger, and his voice was loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear clearly. "You think this is funny?" David shouted at Thomas. "Standing there like some kind of toy soldier while real people are suffering? You're nothing but a glorified scarecrow living off taxpayer money." The tourists around them stopped talking and moving, suddenly aware that something serious was happening. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people began backing away from the confrontation. The cheerful atmosphere of the morning tour had been replaced by tension and uncertainty. Thomas remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead according to his training. He could see David in his peripheral vision, could hear every word being shouted at him, but his discipline held firm. This was exactly the kind of test he had been prepared for, though experiencing it in real life was far more intense than any training scenario. David interpreted Thomas's silence and stillness as arrogance and disrespect. In his mind, the guard was dismissing him, treating him like he didn't matter enough to acknowledge. This perceived slight pushed David's anger to a new level, and he stepped closer to Thomas, his voice becoming even more aggressive and personal. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Thomas had learned about duty, discipline, and the true meaning of strength. David was about to cross a line that would change both their lives, while dozens of tourists watched in growing alarm and disbelief. The moment that would be remembered for years was approaching rapidly. David Brennan stood just 3 feet from Thomas Mitchell, his face twisted with anger and frustration. The morning tourists had formed an uncomfortable circle around them, unsure whether to stay and watch or flee the scene entirely. Camera phones appeared in several hands, though their owners seemed hesitant to actually start recording such a tense confrontation. David's breathing was shallow and rapid now, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. Every word he had shouted at Thomas had been met with perfect silence and stillness, which only fueled his rage further. In his mind, the guard's refusal to acknowledge him was the ultimate sign of disrespect, treating him like he was invisible, worthless, beneath notice. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," David screamed, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls of the castle. "I'm a taxpayer. My money pays your salary. The least you can do is show some basic human decency and acknowledge that I exist." Thomas could feel his heart rate increasing slightly, but his breathing remained controlled and steady. His training had covered this exact scenario dozens of times. An agitated civilian attempting to provoke a reaction through verbal abuse and intimidation. The protocol was clear. Maintain position, remain silent, do not engage unless there is a direct physical threat. But knowing the protocol and living through it were entirely different experiences. Thomas could hear the pain beneath David's anger, could sense that this wasn't really about him or the Queen's Guard at all. This was a man who felt powerless and was desperately trying to regain some sense of control over his life. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger as more tourists noticed the disturbance. Several people had their phones out now, and Thomas knew that whatever happened next would likely be recorded and shared around the world within hours. The thought of his family seeing him in an embarrassing or compromising situation added another layer of pressure to an already difficult situation. David took another step closer to Thomas, now standing less than 2 feet away. The guard could smell the man's coffee breath and see the small beads of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. Every instinct Thomas had developed during his military training was telling him to prepare for physical confrontation. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" David's voice had dropped to a low, menacing tone that was somehow more unsettling than his earlier shouting. "Standing there in your fancy costume pretending to be some kind of hero? But what do you actually do? What have you ever actually accomplished?" The questions hit Thomas harder than David could have known. They echoed doubts that the young guard had wrestled with during his darkest moments. Times when he wondered if his father would be proud of his career choice, or if his girlfriend was right about him wasting his potential on ceremony and tradition. A mother with 2 small children approached the edge of the crowd, took one look at David's aggressive posture and the tension in the air, and quickly ushered her family in the opposite direction. An elderly man who had served in the military himself recognized the signs of a situation about to escalate and quietly used his mobile phone to alert Castle security. Thomas could see the discreet movements of plainclothes security personnel, positioning themselves around the courtyard, but he knew they would not intervene unless absolutely necessary. This was his test to pass or fail, his moment to prove that all the training and discipline he had embraced actually meant something when it mattered most. David's anger was reaching a crescendo, fed by Thomas's continued silence and the growing audience of onlookers. In his distorted thinking, he began to see the crowd not as concerned bystanders, but as witnesses to his humiliation. Here he was, a grown man being ignored by someone he viewed as nothing more than a glorified museum exhibit. "Answer me," David suddenly shouted, loud enough that tourists 50 yards away stopped their conversations and turned to look. "Say something. Do something. Prove that you're actually human and not just some mindless robot." The words stung because they touched on something Thomas had struggled with throughout his service. There were times when the demands of his role made him feel like he was losing pieces of himself, becoming more symbol than person. But his father had taught him that true strength sometimes meant accepting difficult challenges that others couldn't understand or appreciate. David raised his hand and pointed directly at Thomas's face, his finger just inches from the guard's nose. "You're pathetic," he said with venom. "A grown man playing dress-up games while the rest of us deal with real problems in the real world." The crowd had grown silent now, everyone sensing that they were witnessing something that was about to cross a line. Several tourists began backing away, uncomfortable with the increasing aggression they were seeing. Others remained frozen in place, unsure how to react to the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. Thomas felt a bead of sweat run down his back beneath his heavy red tunic, but his face remained perfectly composed. His breathing stayed controlled, his eyes focused straight ahead, his grip on his rifle unchanged. Every fiber of his being was being tested, but his discipline held firm. David interpreted this continued stoicism as the ultimate insult. In his mind, he was pouring out his frustration and pain to someone who couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge his humanity. The injustice of it all overwhelmed what remained of his self-control. "Fine," David said quietly, his voice now deadly calm. "If you won't respond to words, maybe you'll respond to this." Without warning, David drew back his right hand and swung it toward Thomas's face in a hard, angry slap that would have knocked most people off balance. The sound of palm meeting cheek echoed across the stone courtyard like a gunshot, causing several people in the crowd to gasp in shock and disbelief. The moment of impact seemed to stretch forever. David's hand connected with Thomas's face with enough force to turn his head slightly and leave a red mark on his cheek. For just an instant, the perfect discipline of the Queen's Guard was broken by the sudden, unexpected violence. But what happened next would become the stuff of legend, a demonstration of character and strength that would be talked about for years to come. Thomas Mitchell, his cheek stinging from the blow and his pride wounded by the public humiliation, faced the moment that would define not just his career, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor. The silence that followed the slap was deafening. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the courtyard moved or spoke. David Brennan stood with his hand still raised, his face showing a mixture of shock and satisfaction at finally getting a reaction. Thomas Mitchell's head had turned slightly from the force of the blow, a red handprint clearly visible on his left cheek. The crowd of tourists was frozen in disbelief. Several children began crying, frightened by the sudden violence they had witnessed. Adults looked around helplessly, unsure whether they should intervene, call for help, or simply leave the area as quickly as possible. Camera phones that had been recording the confrontation captured the moment of impact, but their owners seemed too stunned to continue filming. David expected Thomas to break character completely now. He expected anger, retaliation, or at the very least some kind of human response to being physically assaulted in front of dozens of strangers. What he got instead was something he had never encountered before in his life. Thomas slowly, deliberately, turned his head back to its original position. His eyes returned to their forward focus. His grip on his rifle remained steady and unchanged. The only evidence of what had just happened was the red mark on his cheek and a slight tightening around his eyes that showed he was exerting tremendous effort to maintain his composure. But Thomas did not strike back. He did not shout. He did not even acknowledge that anything had happened at all. The response was so unexpected, so completely contrary to David's understanding of human nature, that it stopped his anger in its tracks. He had hit this man as hard as he could, humiliated him in front of strangers, and received nothing back except perfect disciplined silence. For David, this moment was more jarring than any retaliation could have been. Violence, he understood. It was the language of frustration and loss of control that he had been speaking all morning. But this quiet strength, this refusal to be drawn into conflict even after being physically attacked, was something entirely foreign to his experience. The plainclothes security officers who had been positioned around the courtyard began moving closer, but they could see that the immediate physical threat seemed to have passed. Thomas's response had actually diffused the situation more effectively than any intervention might have done. An elderly woman in the crowd, who had been watching the entire confrontation unfold, began to weep quietly. She was old enough to understand what she had just witnessed, a demonstration of character and discipline that belonged to a different era, a time when honor and duty meant something more than just words. A teenage boy who had been trying to make the guards laugh just minutes earlier now looked at Thomas with something approaching awe. The contrast between the silly faces he had been making and the profound dignity he was now witnessing was not lost on him. David lowered his hand slowly, his anger beginning to transform into something else entirely. For the first time since approaching Thomas's post, he was really looking at the guard as a person rather than a symbol. He could see the effort it was taking to maintain that perfect stillness, the strength required to absorb such treatment without responding in kind. Thomas, meanwhile, was fighting the hardest battle of his life inside his own mind. Every instinct screamed at him to respond to the assault. His cheek throbbed with pain, and his pride burned with the humiliation of being struck in front of so many people. But deeper than those immediate reactions was something his father had taught him years ago. That true strength was not about proving your power over others, but about proving your power over yourself. The training he had received as a Queen's Guard had prepared him for this moment, but it was his personal character that carried him through it. Thomas understood that his response to this crisis would define not just his own future, but the reputation of every guard who would stand at this post after him. David found himself studying Thomas's face, looking for any sign of the hatred or contempt he expected to see there. Instead, he saw something that confused him completely. There was no anger in the guard's expression, no desire for revenge. There was only duty, discipline, and a kind of quiet sadness that suggested Thomas understood the pain that had driven David to this desperate act. The crowd began to shift and murmur as the initial shock wore off. Several people were speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed, and the consensus seemed to be growing that they had seen something extraordinary. The guard's response was so unexpected, so completely contrary to normal human behavior, that it challenged everyone's assumptions about strength and dignity. A young father who had brought his son to see the castle turned to his child and said quietly, "Remember this moment, son. This is what real courage looks like." David was beginning to feel the weight of what he had done. The anger that had sustained him throughout the morning was evaporating, replaced by a growing awareness of his own behavior. Looking around at the faces in the crowd, the shock, the disapproval, the pity, he began to see himself as others saw him, a middle-aged man who had just assaulted someone who couldn't fight back. But more than the judgment of strangers, it was Thomas's response that was breaking through David's wall of self-righteousness. The guard's refusal to hate him, to respond with violence or even verbal abuse, was forcing David to confront the reality of his actions without the comfort of righteous anger or self-defense. Thomas could sense the change in David's demeanor, could see the aggression draining out of the man's posture. The guard's training had taught him to recognize when a threat was diminishing, and his instincts told him that the worst of the crisis had passed. But he maintained his position and his silence, understanding that his response was still being watched and evaluated by everyone present. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the shadows in the courtyard were growing shorter, but the shadow of the confrontation that had just taken place would stretch much longer, touching the lives of everyone who had witnessed it, and challenging their understanding of what it meant to respond to aggression with grace. David took a step back from Thomas, his hand unconsciously moving to cover his mouth, as if he could somehow take back what he had done. The realization of his actions was hitting him with full force now, and with it came a shame deeper than any he had ever experienced. The transformation in David Brennan was visible to everyone watching. The anger that had driven him to strike Thomas was rapidly being replaced by something much more complex and painful, genuine remorse. As he looked at the red mark still visible on the guard's cheek, the full weight of what he had done began to settle on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. The crowd around them had grown larger as word of the incident spread through the castle grounds. New arrivals pushed forward to see what had happened, while those who had witnessed the confrontation found themselves reluctant to leave. They had seen something unprecedented, and many sensed that the story was not yet over. Thomas remained at his post, but the effort required to maintain his composure was enormous. The physical pain of the slap had faded, but the emotional challenge of the moment continued. He could hear whispered conversations from the crowd, could feel the eyes of dozens of strangers examining his every movement for any sign of weakness or failure. A castle security officer finally approached David, speaking in low, professional tones. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me. We need to discuss what just happened here." But David barely heard the officer's words. His attention was completely focused on Thomas, who continued to stand at perfect attention despite everything that had occurred. The guard's discipline in the face of such treatment was forcing David to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself and his behavior. "Wait," David said to the security officer, his voice much quieter than it had been throughout the morning. "Please, just wait a moment." David looked around at the faces in the crowd, tourists from around the world who had come to Windsor Castle expecting to see ceremony and tradition, not violence and confrontation. He saw disappointment in their expressions, but also something else. They were waiting to see what would happen next, as if they understood that this moment had the potential to become something meaningful. For the first time since approaching Thomas's post, David really looked at the guard as a person, rather than a symbol of his frustrations. He could see the young man's obvious dedication, the physical and mental strength required to maintain such perfect discipline under impossible circumstances. The uniform that David had mocked as a costume now looked like what it actually was, the professional attire of someone committed to serving something larger than himself. Thomas, still maintaining his forward gaze, was acutely aware of David's continued presence. The guard could sense the change in the man's energy, could feel that the immediate threat had passed, but his training and his personal character demanded that he maintain his position regardless of what might happen next. An elderly gentleman who had served in the British Army during World War II pushed through the crowd and approached David. His weathered hands shook slightly as he spoke, but his voice was clear and strong. "Young man," the veteran said quietly, "I fought in 3 different theaters during the war, and I've seen courage in many forms. But what this guard just did, showing restraint and dignity in the face of unprovoked violence, that's the kind of bravery that wins wars and builds nations." The old soldier's words cut through David's remaining defenses like a knife. Here was someone who had actually seen combat, who had witnessed real heroism, and he was suggesting that the guard's response to David's attack was worthy of respect and admiration. David found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what came over me," he said to the veteran, his eyes still fixed on Thomas. "I've been having some problems, and I don't know what I thought." The crowd was listening to every word now, sensing that they were witnessing something important. Several people had their phones out, but they seemed reluctant to record what felt like a deeply personal moment of reckoning. A young mother, who had been holding her daughter throughout the confrontation, stepped forward. "My daughter asked me why that man hit the soldier," she said to David, her voice gentle but firm. "What should I tell her?" The question hit David like a physical blow. The idea that his actions had frightened children, that parents now had to explain violence and anger to kids who had come to the castle for a fun family outing, added another layer to his growing shame. Thomas could hear every word being spoken around him, could feel the emotional weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The guard's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for becoming the center of a profound lesson about human nature and personal responsibility. David looked at the little girl peeking out from behind her mother's legs, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Tell her," David said slowly, "that sometimes adults make very bad choices when they're hurting inside. Tell her that the soldier showed her what real strength looks like, that strong people don't hurt others even when they're hurt themselves." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. What had started as an ugly confrontation was transforming into something much more meaningful, a moment of genuine human connection and understanding. "Tell her," David continued, his voice growing stronger, "that I was wrong, that I let my problems become someone else's burden, and that's not fair or right." Thomas, still maintaining his disciplined stance, felt something shift inside himself. The anger he had been suppressing, the natural human desire for retaliation that he had fought so hard to control, was being replaced by something unexpected, a kind of professional satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal pride. This was why he had chosen to serve. Not for the uniform or the ceremony, but for moments like this when discipline and character could make a real difference in the world. His response to David's attack hadn't just upheld the traditions of the Queen's Guard, it had created an opportunity for growth and understanding that might not have existed otherwise. David took another step back from Thomas. His posture completely changed from the aggressive stance he had maintained throughout the morning. His shoulders sagged with the weight of his remorse, but there was also something else in his bearing, a kind of resolution, as if he was making a decision about who he wanted to be going forward. The security officer who had been waiting patiently stepped forward again. "Sir, we still need to address what happened here. There will be consequences for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard." David nodded, accepting responsibility for his actions in a way that surprised everyone, including himself. "I understand," he said clearly. "I know I need to face whatever comes from this. But first," he turned back toward Thomas, and for the first time since the confrontation began, his voice carried genuine respect. David Brennan stood facing Thomas Mitchell for what he knew would be the last time. The castle courtyard had become an impromptu theater, with tourists from dozens of countries bearing witness to what was unfolding between a disgraced businessman and a disciplined soldier. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones, but the emotional weight of the moment seemed to stop time itself. "I need to say something," David announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. The security officer paused, recognizing that something significant was happening that went beyond normal procedures. Thomas maintained his perfect military bearing, but every person watching could sense the intensity of his attention. Though his eyes remained focused straight ahead and his expression unchanged, there was an alertness about him that suggested he was listening to every word with profound concentration. David cleared his throat, struggling to find words adequate for the moment. "Sir," he began, using the respectful address for the first time since approaching the guard's post. "I don't know your name and you can't tell me what it is, but I want you to know that what you just did, what you chose not to do, that took more strength than I've ever seen from anyone." The crowd pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Phone cameras that had been recording the earlier confrontation now seemed somehow inappropriate, and many people quietly put their devices away, recognizing that some moments were too sacred to commodify. "When I hit you," David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I expected you to hit me back. I wanted you to hit me back. It would have proved that you were no better than me, that your discipline was just an act, that everything you represent was just pretense and ceremony." An older woman in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. She had grown up during World War II and remembered when concepts like duty and honor were more than just words, they were principles that people lived by and sometimes died for. Thomas felt the weight of David's words settling into his consciousness. Throughout his military career, he had wondered if his commitment to discipline and service actually mattered in the modern world. David's acknowledgement was providing an answer he had never expected to receive. "But you didn't hit me back," David continued, his voice now carrying a note of wonder. "You absorbed my anger, my frustration, my complete disrespect, and you gave me nothing but dignity in return. You showed me what real strength looks like, and it's nothing like what I thought it was." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Several people were openly crying, moved by the unexpected transformation they were witnessing. What had begun as an ugly confrontation between an angry man and a stoic guard had become a profound lesson in character and redemption. A young boy who had been trying to make the guards laugh earlier tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered, "why is the man apologizing to the soldier?" "Because," his father replied quietly, "he learned something important about what it means to be strong." David took a step closer to Thomas, but this time his approach carried no threat or aggression. His hands were open at his sides, his posture humble and respectful. "I've been going through some difficult times," he said, "and I let my problems turn me into someone I don't recognize. I blamed you for things that had nothing to do with you. I tried to make you a symbol of everything I thought was wrong with my life." The security officer who had been waiting to escort David away found himself reluctant to interrupt what was clearly becoming a moment of genuine reconciliation. He had seen many incidents during his years at the castle, but nothing quite like this transformation. Thomas could feel the sincerity in David's words, could sense that the man's remorse was genuine and deep. The guard's training had taught him to assess threats and read human behavior, and every instinct told him that the David Brennan standing before him now was completely different from the angry, aggressive man who had struck him just minutes earlier. "You could have had me arrested immediately," David continued. "You could have broken your discipline and fought back, and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you chose to absorb my attack and respond with grace. You turned my anger into shame, my hatred into respect, my violence into a lesson I'll never forget." An elderly gentleman who had served in the Korean War stepped forward from the crowd. "Young man," he said to David, "what you're doing right now, owning up to your mistakes and showing proper respect, that takes courage too. Different kind of courage, but courage nonetheless." David nodded gratefully at the veteran's words, then turned his attention back to Thomas. "I know you can't respond to me," he said, "and I understand why. But I hope you can hear me when I say that I'm sorry. Not just for hitting you, but for everything that led up to it. For disrespecting your service. For treating you like you weren't human. For trying to make my problems into your burden." The crowd began to shift and murmur as people realized they were witnessing something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Many had come to Windsor Castle expecting to see pageantry and tradition, but they were leaving with a deeper understanding of what those traditions actually represented. Thomas maintained his perfect military bearing throughout David's apology, but those watching closely could see subtle changes in his expression, a slight softening around the eyes that suggested he was moved by what he was hearing. The red mark on his cheek was beginning to fade, but the impact of the moment would last much longer. "I know I have to face the consequences of what I did," David said, his voice now completely steady and resolved. "I know there will be charges and penalties, and I accept that. But I needed you to know that your response changed something in me. You showed me what real strength looks like. And it's not about fighting back or proving your power over others. It's about proving your power over yourself." The security officer finally stepped forward again, but his manner was gentler than before. "Sir," he said to David, "we do need to discuss the legal implications of what happened here. But I want you to know that what you just did, taking responsibility and showing genuine remorse, that will be noted in my report." David nodded and turned back to Thomas one final time. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for showing me what honor really means." As David was escorted away from the courtyard, the crowd began to disperse slowly, many people clearly reluctant to leave. They had witnessed something rare and precious, a moment when conflict had been transformed into understanding, when anger had given way to respect, when one person's disciplined response to violence had created an opportunity for another person's redemption. Thomas remained at his post, still maintaining the perfect stillness and silence that his role demanded. But something had changed in him as well. The doubts he had carried about the meaning and relevance of his service had been answered in the most unexpected way possible. His commitment to discipline and honor had created a moment of genuine human connection that would resonate far beyond the castle walls. 6 months later, Thomas Mitchell stood at the same post where his life had been forever changed. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across the Windsor Castle courtyard, and tourists moved through the grounds with the same mixture of curiosity and reverence he had observed for years. But something was fundamentally different now, both in Thomas himself and in how visitors approached the Queen's Guard. The story of the confrontation between David Brennan and Thomas had spread far beyond the castle walls. Videos taken by tourists had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, but what captured people's attention wasn't the moment of violence. It was the extraordinary response that followed. The image of Thomas maintaining his discipline and dignity while David offered a heartfelt public apology had become a symbol of grace under pressure. Thomas had received hundreds of letters from around the world, from people who had been moved by his example. Parents wrote to thank him for showing their children what real strength looked like. Veterans praised his commitment to duty and honor. Young people struggling with anger management issues shared how his example had inspired them to find better ways to handle their emotions. But perhaps the most meaningful letter had come from David Brennan himself. Written from his cell during a brief jail sentence for assault, David's words had been thoughtful and transformative. He wrote about how Thomas's response had forced him to confront not just his behavior that day, but the patterns of thinking and reacting that had led him to that moment. David's letter revealed that he had used his time in jail to seek counseling and anger management training. He had written apology letters to his estranged family and had begun the long process of rebuilding the relationships his anger had damaged. Most significantly, he had started volunteering with programs that helped unemployed professionals deal with job loss and financial stress without resorting to destructive behaviors. The legal consequences for David had been surprisingly modest. The magistrate who heard his case had been moved by the testimonies of witnesses who described both the assault and the sincere apology that followed. David received a suspended sentence, community service hours, and mandatory anger management counseling. But everyone involved recognized that the real transformation had already begun that morning in the castle courtyard. Thomas had been commended by his superiors for his handling of the situation, but he found that the external recognition mattered less than the internal satisfaction of knowing he had lived up to his own standards when it mattered most. The incident had given him a deeper understanding of why the traditions and discipline of the Queen's Guard existed, not just for ceremony, but for moments when character and training could make a real difference in someone's life. The Guard's response had also sparked broader conversations about conflict resolution, emotional regulation, and the power of nonviolent responses to aggression. Psychologists and conflict resolution experts analyzed the incident in academic papers and professional journals, noting how Thomas's disciplined response had created space for David's transformation, rather than escalating the confrontation. Schools began using the story as a teaching tool, helping students understand that true strength wasn't about fighting back against every provocation, but about choosing responses that could lead to positive outcomes. Anger management programs incorporated the incident into their curricula, showing how one person's emotional regulation could influence and transform another person's behavior. Thomas noticed changes in how tourists approached the guards now. There seemed to be more genuine respect and less casual mockery. Parents used his example to teach their children about self-control and dignity. The usual attempts to make the guards laugh or break character continued, but they were gentler now, more playful than disrespectful. On this particular morning, Thomas recognized a familiar figure approaching through the crowd of tourists. David Brennan, looking healthier and more at peace than he had 6 months earlier, walked slowly toward the guard post where their lives had intersected so dramatically. David was not alone. He was accompanied by his teenage daughter, with whom he had successfully reconciled, and a small group of people who appeared to be participants in a support group he now facilitated for individuals dealing with unemployment and life transitions. As they approached Thomas's post, David spoke quietly to his daughter and the group members, clearly explaining the significance of the location and the lesson they had come to observe. There was no aggression in his manner now, no sign of the desperate anger that had driven him to violence months earlier. The group stopped at a respectful distance from Thomas, and David spoke in a voice loud enough for the guard to hear but quiet enough not to disturb other tourists. "This is where I learned that real strength isn't about proving your power over others," he said to his companions. "It's about proving your power over yourself." David's daughter, a bright young woman who had initially been ashamed of her father's behavior, now looked at Thomas with obvious admiration. "Dad told me what happened here," she said to the group. "How this soldier could have fought back but chose not to. How that choice changed everything." Thomas remained perfectly still, but those who knew how to read the subtle signs could see that he was listening intently. The guard had wondered many times over the past months whether his decision to maintain discipline rather than retaliate had truly made a difference, or if David's transformation would have happened anyway. Seeing the man now, calm and purposeful and surrounded by people he was helping in turn, provided the answer. One of the support group members, a woman who had lost her job in the same corporate downsizing that had affected David, asked quietly, "Do you think he remembers you?" David smiled and looked directly at Thomas for a moment before answering. "I think he remembers the lesson we both learned that day. That's what matters." As the group prepared to leave, David stepped slightly closer to Thomas's post and spoke just loudly enough for the guard to hear. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything you taught me about who I want to be." Thomas could not respond, could not acknowledge David's presence or words in any outward way. But as he continued his silent vigil, protecting the traditions and values he had sworn to uphold, he carried with him the knowledge that his commitment to duty and discipline had created ripples that extended far beyond the castle walls. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting new shadows across the ancient courtyard. Tourists continued to flow past Thomas's post, many unaware of the profound drama that had unfolded in that very spot. But the lesson remained, embedded in the stones of Windsor Castle and in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the power of choosing grace over retaliation, discipline over impulse, and dignity over revenge. Thomas Mitchell stood at his post, a guardian not just of royal tradition, but of the timeless truth that real strength comes from within, and that sometimes the most powerful response to violence is the choice not to respond with violence in return.